Breaking news from Austin. Red Bull engineers in shock after Laurent Mekies' post-race inspection reveals something completely unexpected inside Max Verstappen's car. The discovery? A mechanical irregularity that went unnoticed all weekend, hidden behind what looked like a flawless victory. But here's the twist: that very flaw might explain how Verstappen managed to dominate every lap with such surgical precision. Because once Mekies looked closer, what he found wasn't a problem. It was proof of mastery. The weekend had started with precision. Verstappen dominated the sprint on Saturday, taking pole position with almost mechanical consistency. To the casual eye, it looked effortless. But behind the calm exterior, inside the Red Bull garage, Laurent Mekies had already noticed something strange. Tiny inconsistencies in the suspension load feedback, a vibration that appeared in data but never in visible movement. It was the kind of anomaly most teams might ignore, the kind that hides behind perfection. Mekies frowned at the monitor and quietly said to one of his engineers, "It's small, but it's there." They decided to monitor it and say nothing to Max. Of course, they didn't need to. On lap 5 of Friday practice, Verstappen's voice came over the radio, calm as ever. "Rear feels a bit loose under braking. I'll adjust." He didn't sound alarmed. In fact, he sounded almost intrigued. To anyone else, that slight instability would have been a distraction. To Verstappen, it was a signal, an invitation to understand the car's limits even deeper. He wasn't reacting emotionally, he was adapting in real time, recalibrating his driving style through muscle memory. Mekies watched in silence, half in disbelief, as the lap times actually improved. By the time race day arrived, the temperature had soared past 45 degrees on the track. The asphalt rippled, and the bumps on Austin's uneven surface punished every car in the field. Most drivers were complaining of traction issues, brake temperature warnings, and rear-end slide. Verstappen? He was gliding. He launched cleanly from pole, broke DRS distance within 2 laps, and began building what would become one of his most dominant victories of the season. Yet inside the Red Bull garage, Mekies couldn't shake the numbers flashing on his monitor, the same vibration pattern, small but persistent, syncing perfectly with the track's harshest bumps. As the race unfolded, Verstappen's telemetry revealed something extraordinary. His steering inputs began to smooth out, his braking points subtly shifted. Without any external instruction, he had changed the car's dynamic rhythm. Where others were losing grip, Verstappen found balance. Where the car faltered, he compensated. "He's not driving around it," one of the engineers said softly. "He's integrating it." It was as if the car had developed a flaw, and Verstappen was teaching it how to behave. When the checkered flag finally waved, Verstappen crossed the line 8 seconds clear of Lando Norris. The crowd saw domination, Mekies saw defiance. That vibration, that invisible, silent flaw, had never disappeared. It had lived with him the entire race, hidden beneath the perfection of his driving. And in the moments after the finish, when the car rolled back into park firm, Mekies leaned over the pit wall monitor and whispered, almost to himself, "If that's what he can do with a problem, imagine him with perfection." When the engineers began their post-race checks, the numbers confirmed his suspicion. The rear suspension loads on Verstappen's car didn't match the simulation. A subtle asymmetry had appeared in the right-hand control arm, showing signs of irregular stress. The readings weren't catastrophic, but they were strange, inconsistent, rhythmic. Mekies ordered a physical inspection immediately. Within minutes, the floor panels were removed, the car's intricate underbelly exposed under fluorescent light. And there it was, a tiny fracture running along the inner edge of the suspension component, invisible from above but undeniable once the light hit it. It wasn't dramatic, no snapped metal or burned carbon, just a faint crack, almost artistic in its precision. But for an F1 car running at 190 miles per hour, it was enough to change everything. That microscopic fault had been shifting the car's balance ever so slightly through high-speed corners, altering how the suspension distributed load across the rear tires. In other words, Verstappen had been driving a car that was dynamically unstable, and yet his performance had been flawless. The engineers replayed the race telemetry in silence. On lap 14, there it was, a tiny shift in lateral load response. Then again on lap 30, under heavy braking. But what they saw next was even more extraordinary. Verstappen's driving inputs had already compensated. Without being told, without seeing a single warning light, he had adapted. His throttle pressure became smoother. His braking curve, slightly elongated. The data didn't just show skill, it showed anticipation. He was fixing the problem as it was happening, one engineer whispered. He felt it before we even saw it. Mekies leaned back in his chair, staring at the monitor with a faint smile. "That's Max," he said softly. "He doesn't just drive the car. He reads it." It wasn't hyperbole. It was science. Every lap, Verstappen had been subconsciously rewriting the car's balance sheet, transferring load with millimetric steering input, adjusting his torque application to keep the rear stable, compensating for an issue that would have caused chaos in anyone else's hands. When the full report came in, the room fell silent. The vibration that had first appeared in Friday practice hadn't gone away, it had evolved, growing worse as the race went on. By the final 10 laps, the stress on the cracked suspension arm was nearing structural limits. One more aggressive curb strike could have triggered total failure. "He was driving a ticking bomb," said one of the senior engineers. "And he still pulled 8 seconds on Norris." Mekies didn't respond right away. He just stared at the broken piece sitting on the workbench. It was a reminder of how fine the line is between perfection and disaster in this sport. "Finally," he said, "we build these cars with precision. But what Max does is something beyond engineering. He's the safety system we can't design." Later, when Verstappen arrived at the debrief, he didn't seem surprised. "You found it, huh?" he said, nodding toward the damaged suspension arm. Mekies raised an eyebrow. "You felt it?" Max shrugged. "Yeah. I could sense it was loading differently. The rear wasn't breathing the same in turns 8 and 9. But it was manageable." The room went silent again, not out of disbelief, but respect. Verstappen had been diagnosing structural fatigue in real time, through nothing but feel. As he left the room, Mekies turned to his team and said quietly, "That's why he wins." For the rest of the night, the engineers continued their inspection, recalculating structural limits, running simulations. They realized that the fracture had begun forming as early as lap 10, a lifetime in Formula One terms. Yet Verstappen's lap times had remained within a 2/10 window for the entire second half of the race. That kind of consistency under mechanical instability wasn't human, it was symphonic. He had turned a mechanical failure into an advantage, using the instability to generate micro-rotation through the corners, something no simulation could ever teach. At sunrise on Monday morning, Red Bull's technical headquarters in Milton Keynes was silent except for the hum of data servers. The team's Austin freight had barely arrived, and already, the engineers were gathered around the simulator room. In the center of the main screen, Verstappen's telemetry from the United States Grand Prix was displayed in overlapping colors: throttle, brake, load, vibration, and steering. To the untrained eye, it looked like noise. To Laurent Mekies, it was a conversation between man and machine. They started by comparing Verstappen's data to the model of the car's ideal behavior. Normally, the simulator prediction and real-world execution line up within fractions of a percent. But this time, there was an anomaly, a small divergence between the predicted load transfer and the real one. It confirmed what Mekies already knew: Verstappen had been compensating. The right rear suspension had begun to fail, shifting balance through every high-speed corner. But rather than fight it, Verstappen had absorbed it. "Look at the steering trace," one engineer said. The line was unnaturally smooth, a perfect arc where you'd expect tiny corrections. "He's averaging the vibration manually," another added. Mekies nodded. "He was damping the oscillation himself," he said. He became the suspension. It wasn't a metaphor. By analyzing the micro-timing of his inputs, the team realized Verstappen's natural reflexes were synchronizing with the car's vibration frequency, countering instability not after it happened, but as it happened. His brain and muscles had effectively replaced the damaged mechanical system. For engineers who live in a world of numbers and control systems, this was almost spiritual. "We build algorithms to predict vibration," one of them said. "He feels them before we can measure them." Mekies said nothing, just leaned forward with quiet pride. That's the difference between good drivers and generational ones, he finally said. He doesn't react. He predicts. The team's aerodynamic specialists joined in later that morning. They replayed his onboard footage in slow motion, watching the RB21 subtle roll and pitch through the fast sequence of turns 7 to 11. Normally, any car with a fractured suspension arm would show instability oversteer, understeer, tire chatter. Verstappen's didn't. He had altered his line mid-race to reduce load stress without losing apex speed. It was as if he had reprogrammed the car's geometry through instinct. He's reading the air as much as the asphalt, said one of the aero analysts. He treats drag and balance like variables, not constants. By mid-afternoon, the full technical post-mortem was complete. The cause of the damage was vibration resonance amplified by the circuit's notorious bumps. The metal fatigue had begun during qualifying. It should have escalated into failure by lap 20. It didn't, because Verstappen's control inputs absorbed the additional energy instead of letting it propagate. In physics terms, he'd turned a structural defect into harmonic stability. In racing terms, he'd saved the race. Mekies wrote a short memo to the team at Red Bull's upper management summarizing it in one sentence. The suspension didn't survive the race, Max sustained it. Meanwhile, the world outside Milton Keynes was catching up with what had happened. Motorsports journalists began reporting the story late Monday evening. Motorsport.com ran the headline, "Verstappen wins with structural fracture genius or luck?" The BBC's F1 podcast called it the drive of the year. And Sky Sports simply described it as instinct made visible. But perhaps the most telling reactions came from Verstappen's rivals. Fernando Alonso, asked about Mekies' discovery, paused for a long moment before answering. When the car fails, you feel fear first. Then frustration. But for him, it seems like curiosity. That's rare. It's like he and the car share a nervous system. Coming from Alonso, a man who has spent his life mastering the unpredictable, it was the highest form of praise. Lando Norris was more direct. "We were pushing all weekend, and he was still ahead. Now we find out he had a broken suspension? That's not racing skill, that's awareness on another level." Even Lewis Hamilton, never one for superlatives, admitted on social media, "It takes feel to drive fast. But it takes genius to keep it fast when the car's broken." Credit where it's due. Inside Red Bull, the engineers printed a copy of Mekies' internal report and pinned it to the simulator wall. The line that caught everyone's eye wasn't the technical jargon, but the simple conclusion written at the bottom. He doesn't just drive the car. He completes it. For days afterward, the Austin data became a kind of legend within the team. Analysts began referring to Verstappen's unique input style as dynamic symmetry, the phenomenon where his mechanical feedback aligns with the car's natural frequency. It wasn't luck. It was neurological precision. The kind that turns milliseconds into victories.